Imagine walking into work one Monday morning and finding out the company you devoted your life to, a 158-year-old giant of Wall Street, has disappeared overnight. Gone. That's exactly what happened to thousands of employees at Lehman Brothers in 2008. The firm wasn't just another bank. It was the beating heart of global finance. And then, in a matter of days, it was ashes. This is the backdrop of a colossal failure of common sense. The inside story of how one of America's oldest and proudest banks ignored every warning sign. Until it was too late. What followed was the biggest mistake in U.S. banking history, a collapse so violent it set off shockwaves around the world. In the next few minutes, we'll uncover the clues, the blind spots, and the fatal decisions that turned Lehman into a global cautionary tale. And more importantly, we'll uncover what this means for you, how to protect your money, your investments, and your future from the very same traps that brought Wall Street to its knees. Picture a kid standing in the wreckage of a family life that just blew apart. That was me. 10 years old, watching my father walk out, my mother left alone with 5 children, and a house that looked perfect from the outside, but felt hollow inside. Dad was a chemical engineer turned plastics entrepreneur, the kind of guy who might as well have been cast in The Graduate. Ambitious, successful, obsessed with golf and business. My mother? A stunning fashion model, appearing on billboards, adored in magazines. But in our kitchen, she was crying, overworked, overwhelmed. And then came the morning that burned itself into my memory. Ed O'Brien S. Mercedes, brand new, gleaming, parked outside our house. My father pulls up, a golf club in hand. Calm focus, like he was lining up a shot on the 18th. He takes one swing, shatters the windshield. Another swing, headlights gone. He moves to the back. Both taillights explode in red glass. Precision, control, like he was practicing on the course. Years later, I asked him about it. He said, slow and serious, didn't need any more than a pitching wedge. That was my father. Brutal, efficient, unapologetic. That violence, though, wasn't just about cars. It seeped into our lives. Divorce pushed us from comfort into chaos. My mother, once gracing runways, now trying to hold 5 kids together in a Worcester housing project called Lincoln Village. A place so rough it felt like danger sat waiting outside your door. The neighbors weren't just unfriendly. They were angry, hustling, ready to drag me into fights or petty crimes. When I refused, I got punched in the face on my own doorstep. My mother cried more than I'd ever seen. We were broke, displaced, and ashamed. But Dad, for all his wreckage, gave me something else. He was a bear. Not just a pessimist, but the kind of investor who saw disaster as opportunity. To him, cash was safety, and history was a series of crashes waiting to repeat. The crash of '29 lived in his mind like a scar. He warned me constantly, don't believe it can't happen again. It always can. Golf was his therapy. Finance was his battlefield. And those mantras history repeats, disaster is never far, carved themselves into me. Eventually, the family scraped out of Worcester. Cape Cod saved us, at least for a while. But by then, I was already scarred. I was behind in school, barely a C student, still chasing the shadow of what I'd lost. And yet, in that mess, my father took me to Notre Dame. He walked me around campus, silent, proud. I asked why, since I could never make it there. He looked me straight in the eye and said, it's not where you start, it's where you finish. That line followed me like a compass. So when I landed at UMass Dartmouth, not Harvard, not Yale, I carried it with me. I clawed my way into economics, pulled straight A's, and dreamed of Wall Street. But there was one problem. Nobody on Wall Street wanted me. They wanted Harvard kids with uncles in boardrooms. I was a kid from UMass with no connections. So I started hustling. Letters, resumes, cold calls, hundreds, then thousands. Rejections poured back like machine gun fire. That's when I got crafty. I barged past receptionists, lied about appointments, showed up with flowers, even posed as a pizza delivery guy. Sausage, mushrooms, extra cheese for Mr. Matthews. Empty boxes, real suit underneath. Anything to sneak in front of a manager. Most threw me out. A few, amused by my audacity, gave me 5 minutes. What they all told me was the same. Kid, go sell something. Anything. Learn sales. So I did. Pork chops. Frozen food. Door to door. I pitched old ladies, young couples, anyone who would listen. I learned how to take rejection, how to turn no into a maybe, how to sell convenience, security, and comfort wrapped in plastic and ice. And I was good, top salesman in the region. But it wasn't pork chops I wanted. It was bonds, stocks, risk, the fire, the trading floor. Then came the real key, the Series 7 exam, the license to enter the arena, 6 hours of pure finance. Options, regulations, margins, taxes. I studied until my eyes burned, surrounded by Wharton kids with big names and bigger futures. Me? I had no sponsor except a sleazy bucket shop full of fat guys in smoke-filled rooms pushing worthless penny stocks on desperate retirees. They offered to file my paperwork for a price. I took it, passed the exam with a 92, and held in my hand the key to the gates of Wall Street. When Merrill Lynch finally gave me a shot in Philadelphia, it wasn't glamorous. It was cold calling strangers, begging for trust, fighting to survive on $18,000 a year plus commission. But I was inside, past the walls on the field, finally breathing the same air as the Giants. And every pitch I made, every rejection I swallowed, I could feel it. The road was long, rocky, but I was climbing. And I didn't know it yet. But that climb was leading me straight into the center of the storm that would one day swallow the world's most powerful banks whole. Imagine sitting in a cramped office above a Chinese restaurant in Connecticut, staring at glowing computer screens, and realizing you just spooked one of the biggest banks on earth. That was me and my buddy Steve, running ConvertBond.com, a scrappy little website that somehow had the power to rattle giants like Morgan Stanley. It all started with bonds, convertible bonds to be exact. They were quirky little creatures, half stock, half bond, like financial chameleons. Most people ignored them, but we obsessed over them. We tracked every issue, rated them, called out the weak ones. And people noticed. Traders in Tokyo, bankers in London, investors in New York, they all logged on. At its peak, our site pulled in 250,000 hits a day. For a niche product, that was unheard of. But popularity cuts both ways. One morning the phone rang, and on the line was Tony Bosco, Morgan Stanley's heavyweight in convertible securities. He didn't call to chat. He exploded. His voice boomed through the receiver. Threats of lawsuits, armies of lawyers, bankruptcy by legal fees. Why? Because we had trashed one of his bonds. We set the coupon. The interest rate paid was lousy. The credit behind it shaky. Our users agreed. And suddenly, Morgan Stanley couldn't sell the thing. Think about that. Two guys above a dry cleaner, armed with laptops and attitude, had just dented the armor of a Wall Street titan. Bosco raged, but beneath the anger there was fear. He knew something dangerous. Our little site had influence. If we gave a bad review, investors thought twice. If we mocked a bond, its chances of survival dropped. We weren't just analysts anymore. We were gatekeepers. Rumors swirled that big banks, even Swiss powerhouses like UBS, wanted to buy us. Articles hinted at acquisitions. Morgan Stanley must have felt the walls closing in. Imagine being in their shoes. Every time you launched a new bond, you had to worry what these guys above a restaurant might say. It was like having a food critic who could close your restaurant with a single bad review. Of course, Steve and I weren't saints. We stoked the drama. We hinted about starting our own trading desk, an online bond trading empire that would rival the giants. We didn't have the capital, the building, or the infrastructure, but we had brains, guts, and a platform people trusted. Sometimes bluffing is half the game, and Wall Street hates uncertainty more than it hates losing. The tension with Morgan Stanley escalated. Bosco called again, calmer this time, but the message was clear. We were a problem, and problems get dealt with. Behind his words, I could sense the calculation. Should Morgan Stanley crush us, buy us, or quietly adapt to us? The balance of power was shifting. If only a little, what kept us alive was simple. Truth. Investors knew we weren't sugarcoating. We said a bad bond was bad. We said a weak coupon was weak. And they believed us because, unlike the big banks, we didn't have billions riding on the outcome. We weren't spinning the story. We were calling it as we saw it. That authenticity was our shield. But running a revolution out of a second-floor office has limits. We worked insane hours, fueled by caffeine and adrenaline, watching as ConvertBond.com became a force. Journalists called. Bankers whispered. Traders followed our every post. For a while, we lived in that electric buzz, convinced we were rewriting the rules. And then came the turning point. Steve, my partner in crime, decided he'd had enough. After years of hustling, he walked away, bought himself a plane, and flew off to the Bahamas. Just like that, I lost my wingman. Suddenly, the noise, the threats, the pressure, it all landed squarely on my shoulders. That's when Morgan Stanley stopped being just an adversary and became my new reality. The Holy Grail, as I called it, wasn't out in the market anymore. It was sitting inside their offices in New York. I had to chase it, grab it, and prove myself in the very halls of the institution that once threatened to bury me. Funny how life works. One chapter you're dodging lawsuits from a bank, the next you're walking through its doors as an employee. But underneath it all, the lesson stuck. Even the biggest players can be rattled by a couple of outsiders with the courage to call things as they are. And rattling giants? That thrill never leaves you. And what I didn't realize back then was this. Shaking Morgan Stanley was just practice. Ahead of me was a storm far greater, one that would make those phone calls from Bosco look like harmless static. The fall after Enron went up in flames felt like the whole financial world was wobbling on its axis. Every week brought another headline of some towering company toppling into bankruptcy. And here's the kicker. Nearly all of them had one thing in common, convertible bonds. Those odd hybrids, part stock and part debt, became the fuse that lit the explosions. Steve Seefeld and I, still fresh off building ConvertBond.com, weren't ready for the stiff suits and mahogany boardrooms of a place like Morgan Stanley. We'd been pirates, not admirals. Our startup had run on instinct, improvisation, and caffeine, not corporate memos and endless committees. We built something worth millions without ever holding a formal meeting, without ever needing to circle back or draft a 50-slide PowerPoint. If there was a problem, we set it straight. If we made a mistake, we admitted it. If something needed doing, we did it. Simple. But big corporations? They were jungles of people terrified of making the wrong call. Layers of managers, each one ducking responsibility like kids dodging dodgeballs. Fear ruled. Fear of being wrong, of being the scapegoat, of having your name tied to the next blow-up. So instead of action, you got memos. Endless memos. Pages of carefully chosen words designed to say everything and nothing at the same time, just enough so you could wave the document later and claim, "See? I warned you." Steve hated it. He wasn't built to play that game, and truthfully, neither was I. But the machine of Wall Street had swallowed our creation, and now we had to live inside its belly. Meetings upon meetings. Consultants analyzing our website as though it were a patient in intensive care, recommending refinements. Refinements for a site that already had more traffic than they could dream of. They weren't refining. They were meddling, flexing their egos. Still, we gritted our teeth and kept going. I told myself this was the price of access, a ticket inside the gates. But deep down, I missed the chaos of the startup, the freedom of calling things exactly as they were. Because on Wall Street, truth was dangerous. Say the wrong thing, even if it was obvious, and you might find yourself walking out with a cardboard box. That tension exploded when the market started cracking. Enron was just the first domino. The smell of panic spread, and every day more balance sheets collapsed under the weight of lies, leverage, and greed. Steve and I saw it clearly, the way my father, the Eternal Bear, had always warned. History doesn't just rhyme. It repeats like a bad song stuck on loop. And when the market shudders, only the bears, the ones who bet on failure, allow themselves a grin. Short selling became the weapon of choice. To most people, it sounded almost evil. Betting against companies, profiting when they went down. But really, it was survival. If you knew a ship was sinking, would you buy a cabin ticket or would you sell lifeboats? That's what shorting was, lifeboats. Borrow the stock, sell it at today's price, wait for it to crash, buy it back cheaper, pocket the difference. While bulls wept and clung to their dreams, the bears quietly counted cash. I'd grown up around that mindset. My dad was a bear's bear. He saw through the sunshine, sniffed out the cracks, and reminded me constantly, it can always happen again. Don't ever forget that. And here it was, happening again. Portfolios blowing up, families losing homes, pension funds collapsing. While the talking heads kept insisting everything was fine, Steve and I stared at screens that screamed otherwise. Inside Morgan Stanley, though, reality was muffled. People clung to optimism like drunks clutching their last bottle. The culture wasn't built for bad news. Nobody wanted to be the guy who stood up in a room full of bullish executives and said, "We're headed for disaster." In that world, cynics were pariahs, which meant, ironically, the only ones smiling were the bears. And Steve? He was drifting. He didn't want to play corporate politics, didn't want to battle bosses who value cover-your-ass strategies over clear-eyed judgment. I could feel him slipping away, restless, dreaming of escapes that didn't involve Bloomberg terminals. He talked about planes, about freedom, about getting out. And soon enough, that's exactly what he did. Left the world of Wall Street behind and took off, literally, for the skies. For me, though, the bear's smile wasn't just satisfaction. It was a signal. I knew I was moving closer to where the real fight would be. Deeper inside the system, into the very heart of the beast that was already showing cracks in its armor. What I didn't realize was how soon those cracks would split wide open, and how standing in the middle of them would feel less like smiling and more like staring into an abyss. Because if Enron was a tremor, what came next would be an earthquake. Walking into Lehman Brothers for the first time felt like stepping into a cathedral. Marble floors, soaring glass walls, a sense of history humming in the air like static. It was July 2004, and I was now officially inside one of the grandest temples of finance the world had ever known. 16 years earlier, I couldn't even get my foot in the door of a brokerage house. Now here I was, walking into Lemon's gleaming tower on 7th Avenue, badge around my neck, stomach tight with both pride and fear. But before the elevators even closed, whispers followed me. Tales of Dick Fuld, the man at the top, chairman, CEO, legend, dictator. Depending on who you ask, he was either a warrior king or a tyrant. His temper was infamous. His rages echoed down corridors. Threats, vengeance, grudges. The man collected enemies the way golfers collect scorecards. I hadn't even seen him yet, but his shadow fell over everything. People spoke of him like you'd speak of a caged lion, fascinating, terrifying, and best admired from a safe distance. Ford had earned his reputation the hard way, clawing his way up Lemon through decades of battles. He'd survived coups, betrayals, and near-death moments for the firm. To his followers, he was the gorilla. To his doubters, he was a relic clinging to a throne. Either way, everyone agreed on one thing. He ruled from an ivory tower. Rarely seen on the trading floors, insulated on the 31st floor behind mahogany doors and antique furniture. He was the king of Lemon's empire, but also strangely apart from it. The firm itself was a monument to ambition. Its roots went back to 3 Bavarian brothers who set up shop in Alabama in the 1840s, selling dry goods before moving into cotton, then banking, then securities. Through civil wars, industrial revolutions, and market crashes, Lemon grew into a financial powerhouse. By the time I arrived, It wasn't just a bank. It was a legend. Walking those halls, you felt the weight of ghosts. Generations of traders, deal makers, schemers who had built, lost, and rebuilt fortunes. And yet, despite the grandeur, there was rot in the foundation. Ford's leadership style had shaped the firm into something brittle. He refused to have a strong second in command. History had scarred him. Years earlier, he'd watched a mentor get stabbed in the back by a deputy who grew too ambitious. Ford swore that would never happen to him. So he surrounded himself with loyalists, men like Joe Gregory, his longtime lieutenant. Joe wasn't a visionary. He wasn't even a particularly sharp strategist. But he was loyal, and for Ford, loyalty mattered more than brilliance. Down on the trading floors, what I like to call the gun deck, the mood couldn't have been more different. That's where the cannons roared. Real risk, real deals, real blood. You learned fast or you died fast. I was lucky to be in the orbit of some of the sharpest minds I'd ever met. Alex Kirk, Michael Gelbin, Richard Gatwood, Larry McCarthy. Watching them in action was like watching master chess players who also happened to enjoy bar fights. They anticipated moves, sniffed out weakness, switched strategies mid-battle. These guys weren't hiding in ivory towers. They were in the mud, trading billions as casually as some people buy lunch. But even with these warriors, the tower loomed above us. Ford and Gregory spent their time scheming on the 31st floor, massaging stock prices, dressing up bad news, shouting about culture and loyalty, while quietly amassing vast piles of shares for themselves. The disconnect was glaring. Down below, people fought minute by minute to keep the ship afloat. Up top, the captains seemed more concerned with keeping their crowns polished. To me, it felt like living in two different worlds inside the same building. On the ground, you smelled sweat, fear, victory, and loss. Upstairs, you smelled polish, power, and paranoia. And the gap between the two would only grow. Still, for a kid who once sold frozen pork chops door to door, it was surreal. I'd made it. I was in the game, sitting on the gun deck of one of the mightiest warships on Wall Street. But I couldn't shake a question, one that gnawed at me every time I looked up at that marble tower. What happens when the man in the ivory tower stops hearing the cannons? Because a ship can't sail forever if the captain can't smell the gunpowder. It began like a fairy tale. Sun-scorched California towns filling with shiny new houses, brokers tanned like lifeguards, selling dreams that looked invincible. Stockton, out in the Central Valley, became the poster child of this miracle. Rows of asparagus fields were bulldozed to make room for subdivisions with names like Sunset Creek and Riverbend Estates. A family could roll in from San Francisco, escape the suffocating Bay Area prices, and snag a 4-bedroom home for $230,000. Cheap, clean, brand new. It was the American dream rebooted. And here's the kicker. You didn't even need money to buy one. Enter the ninja loan. No income, no job, no assets. Sounds like a joke, right? But this wasn't satire. It was business. Slick brokers in polo shirts would sit across from families who had no savings, no proof of earnings, sometimes not even steady work, and say, "Don't worry, you're approved." The loans often came in bigger than the price of the house itself. Imagine that you borrowed $250,000 to buy a $230,000 home, pocket the extra $20,000, and walk away with both keys and cash. To the buyers, it was a miracle. To the brokers, it was commission heaven. To Wall Street, it was rocket fuel. The shadow banks drove the frenzy. These weren't banks in the old-fashioned sense. No savings accounts, no depositors, just outfits with slick names like Loan City, Seabreeze, and Mortgage Warehouse. They didn't have their own money, so they borrowed from real banks, then lent it out at insane volumes. Lend, repackage, resell, repeat. They were middlemen, flipping risk like real estate flippers flipped houses. And Stockton wasn't alone. The boom swept Florida, Nevada, Arizona. Suburbs mushroomed in deserts where water had to be piped in. The housing fever turned waiters, janitors, even bus drivers into owners of $500,000 homes. Everyone believed they win because house prices only went one way, up. If you couldn't pay your mortgage, no problem. Just refinance next year, cash out again, and let the rising market cover your tracks. Back at Lehman, the mortgage guys swaggered into meetings like movie stars arriving late to the Oscars. They had the numbers. Month after month, their profits dwarfed everyone else's. Billions streamed in as they flipped mortgage into CDOs, collateralized debt obligations. Those Frankenstein bundles of loans sliced and diced into tranches and sold off worldwide. Europe, Asia, small towns in Iceland. Everyone wanted a piece of the safe American housing machine. We on the trading floors joke quietly about Stockton and its teaser loans, those artificially low rates that would later reset sky high. But those jokes were never cracked in front of the mortgage kings. You couldn't argue with their results. They had the ultimate retort. We're making more money than anyone in the building. And they were right. I watched the numbers with both awe and unease. Miracles, in my experience, don't last. Transforming shaky debt into gold-edged securities felt like turning tap water into Chateau Lafite. For a while, the trick worked. But every magician knows there's always a limit to how long you can hold the audience spellbound. The press fed the frenzy. Newspapers ran glowing profiles of ordinary folks becoming paper millionaires just by sitting in their houses. Politicians cheered rising homeownership. Builders couldn't lay foundations fast enough. Stockton's population swelled by 5,000 every year. Glossy brochures stuffed mailboxes daily, promising easy money, credit cards with absurd limits, and refinancing schemes stacked on top of refinancing schemes. But beneath the glitter, rot spread. Stockton had the highest illiteracy rate in America. Half the borrowers couldn't even read their contracts. They signed anyway, trusting the smiling brokers who assured them nothing could go wrong. Nobody pointed out that their 1% teaser rate could balloon to 10% in a few years, turning monthly payments into financial quicksand. Why would the brokers care? They collected their fees the moment the ink dried. Inside Lehman, the fourth floor turned into a kind of financial Olympus. The mortgage desk pumped profits so big, it seemed like they had found a cheat code for capitalism. They were untouchable, almost divine. And yet, late at night, I couldn't help wondering, what happens when the music stops? What happens when those ninja loans, handed out like candy, come due? Still, nobody wanted to hear doubt. Questioning the miracle was heresy. You'd be branded a traitor to the culture, maybe even shown the door. So the skepticism stayed silent, bottled up behind clenched teeth. On the surface, we toasted the profits. Underneath, a few of us wondered if we were standing on a waterway about to flood. And Stockton? It became the symbol. A lush valley, a geographic marvel, turned into a sprawling experiment in financial alchemy. It looked like paradise, with its rivers and wetlands glistening under California's sun. But it was built on loans to people who had no business carrying them. A city rising on sand, painted over to look like marble. We called it a miracle. But miracles, by definition, defy reality, and reality always fights back. And when it did, it wouldn't just drown Stockton. It would swamp the entire global financial system. By the spring of 2007, the mood inside Lehman felt like a party that had gone on too long. The music was still playing, the lights were still bright, but you could sense it. Something in the air was turning sour. Stock and bond markets were still climbing, almost stubbornly, as if refusing to admit gravity existed. But down in the distressed division, where I sat, smiles were scarce. We saw the cracks. We smelled the rot. And then came Larry McCarthy's farewell. June 6th. A warm night in New York, at the Red Lion down by Washington Square, a shrine to rock and roll with dark wood, red leather, and a bar long enough to drown in. We rented the whole place, packed it with 120 people, all the faces that mattered in Larry's life. His wife Suzanne flew in from Florida. Colleagues who adored him showed up. Larry was the kind of man who'd notice if someone was missing and send a car, or show up himself. His heart was as oversized as his reputation. That night we laughed till our ribs hurt. A band cranked out Grateful Dead songs. Larry roasted us all, joked about the women's work outfits, teased the senior salesman, declared that a brand new guitar had surely marked the top of the market. We laughed, but beneath it all, the mood was heavy. Because Larry's departure wasn't just one man leaving. It was a signal, a crack in the armor, a warning that the golden age of Lehman's gun deck was fading. By the next morning, the hangover wasn't just from beer. Bart McDade, one of our sharpest leaders, showed up 4 minutes late. 4 minutes. For a man who'd walked in at 6 and sharp every single day of his working life, those 4 minutes were thunder. It meant something had shifted. From then on, everywhere we looked, trouble loomed. Lehman's balance sheet was stuffed with bloated real estate bets, especially in California. One name stood out, cursed like a scar: Sunkel. The dream development that was supposed to be 6,000 homes with a golf course and boating lakes. Lehman had poured money into it, first $150 million, then $350 million, then nearly $2 billion in total. By 2008, it was nothing but sand, weeds, and an abandoned clubhouse. A black hole sucking Lehman's future into dust. Inside the firm, frustration boiled. Mike Gelbin, one of the sharpest risk minds we had, exploded in a meeting. Did anyone authorize this, or did it just happen? His rage spoke for all of us. Nobody could pin down who had signed off on these insane exposures. Was it Mark Walsh, who ran the real estate book like a cowboy? Was it Joe Gregory, whispering to Fuld? Or was it Fuld himself, the king in his ivory tower, too insulated to see the damage? The truth didn't matter. The losses were real, and the numbers were monstrous. Lehman now looked less like an investment bank and more like a reckless property speculator, a REIT dressed in a banker's suit. We were choking on illiquid commercial real estate, billions tied up in assets nobody wanted. Markets were sliding, buyers disappearing. Every valuation on our books looked like a fairy tale, priced at yesterday's highs while today's realities screamed collapse. And yet, Fuld clung to Gregory, his oldest ally, while brilliant operators like Gelbin and Alex Kirk were sidelined. Alex tried to fight back. He sold down billions in leveraged loans, eating $1.5 billion in losses, but saving us from losing $10 billion more. He was the only one still swinging at the tide, trying to cut loose the anchors before they dragged us under. But his battle was lonely, uphill, and resented by the very leaders who should have backed him. Walking the streets of Manhattan at night, I couldn't shake the unease. The city glittered, limousines sliding past, laughter spilling out of restaurants, money flowing like champagne. But beneath it all, I felt it. The foreboding. The storm gathering. The sense that this prosperity was paper thin stretched over a chasm. By early 2008, reality hit hard. Lehman stock slid. Mortgage subsidiaries fired brokers in droves. The CDO market flatlined. In our warehouses, mountains of junk debt sat unsellable. The mood darkened, paranoia spread. Even I, fresh off record profits, felt the noose tightening. The culture had turned poisonous. Loyalty was rewarded. Dissent was punished. And I belonged to the wrong tribe, the cynics who spoke truths nobody wanted to hear. Then came March 10, 2008. I walked into the office at 6 o'clock sharp, same as always. But something was off. People missing. Whispers everywhere. 3 hours later, I got the call to head upstairs. And in that moment, I knew. It was over. The end of the affair wasn't just about me losing my seat. It was about the unraveling of Lehman's soul. The warriors of the gun deck, the truth tellers, the risk managers. One by one, we were pushed out. What remained was the hollow echo of leadership obsessed with loyalty, blind to danger, insulated by arrogance. And in that hollow space, the seeds of Lehman's death took root. The story of General Motors inside Lehman Brothers didn't start with cars. It started with debt, mountains of it. By the mid-2000s, GM wasn't the proud titan of Detroit anymore. It was a giant stumbling under the weight of pensions, healthcare promises, and a market that had fallen out of love with its gas guzzlers. To Wall Street, GM looked less like a car company and more like a slow-motion train wreck wrapped in chrome. But here's the twist. Buried inside that wreck was gold. At least, that's what we believed on the distressed desk. Because GM owned GMAC, its finance arm, and GMAC owned a big chunk of the mortgage market. Sound familiar? The same fever-gripping Stockton and Florida suburbs had its fingerprints all over GM's books. If GMAC blew up, GM went with it. If GMAC survived, maybe, just maybe, the old car maker had a shot. Inside Lehman, bets on GM became a battlefield. On one side were the optimists. Traders convinced GM could outlast the storm, retool, reinvent. On the other were the cynics, who saw nothing but doom, pointing to rising oil prices, sliding sales, and unions demanding blood. Every conversation felt like courtroom drama, evidence piled high on both sides. Larry McCarthy, fearless as ever, went in heavy. He saw opportunity in the wreckage, buying GM bonds like a poker player who couldn't fold a hand. His faith wasn't just in the numbers. It was in the principle that when everyone else panics, that's when fortunes are made. Larry wasn't alone. Joe Beggins, another warhorse of the floor, rode shotgun on the bed. Together they staked tens of millions. Certain GM's assets, factories, land, even fleets of cars, were worth more than the market was pricing. But betting on GM was like betting on a sick horse in a storm. News headlines hammered away, plunging quarterly profits, whispers of bankruptcy, credit downgrades. GM CEO Rick Wagoner tried to project calm, promising reinvention, hybrids, cost cuts. The reality? Each quarter brought red ink, and each press release sounded more desperate. Meanwhile, our desks buzzed with rumors that GM's survival hinged less on Detroit and more on Washington. Would the government step in? Would taxpayers bail out the oldest of the big three? It was déjà vu. The same whispers that swirled later around Lehman swirled first around GM. Too big to fail? Or too far gone to save? I remember nights when we sat staring at Bloomberg terminals, watching GM bonds tick down penny by penny. You could almost feel the collective heartbeat of the market. Every downgrade, every strike threat from the United Auto Workers, every oil price jump sent those bonds sliding deeper into the abyss. And yet, Larry held. "They've got Boeings," he'd say, half joking, reminding us GM wasn't some paper company. They had factories, fleets, tangible steel. He believed the market was mispricing reality. What struck me was how personal the fight became inside Lehman. GM wasn't just another ticker. It was a test of philosophy. Were we contrarians willing to dig for value when others fled? Or were we gamblers blind to disaster? By early 2006, though, reality came knocking. GM posted losses so steep they made headlines worldwide. GMAC's mortgage bet soured. The stock slid towards single digits. Credit markets priced in bankruptcy. The optimists on the floor grew quieter. Even Larry, defiant as he was, stopped cracking jokes about cheap bonds. The silence was louder than any speech. And yet, we learned something in that crucible. GM's fall wasn't just about cars or even mortgage. It was about denial. A company that had once ruled the world couldn't adapt fast enough, couldn't face the truth of its bloated costs and outdated strategies. In that way, GM became a mirror for Lehman itself. A proud giant, steeped in history, staggering under bad bets and stubborn leadership. By the time GM finally spiraled into government bailout talks, most of us knew the verdict. It wasn't just a tragedy for Detroit. It was a rehearsal for what would later engulf us all. The axemen hadn't yet arrived at Lehman, but you could hear the footsteps in Detroit. And soon enough, they'd be walking our hallways too. When Bart McDade finally took the reins, it wasn't with fanfare. It was with exhaustion. The firm had been battered, the walls were closing in, and he was the reluctant general shoved onto the battlefield after too many others had fallen. Still, when more than 300 managing directors, the brains and muscle of Lehman, gathered to meet him, the relief in the room was palpable. "Well done, Bart. We're with you." Some even whispered, "Thank God." It was less a coronation and more a collective sigh of survival. Bart wasn't naive. He knew exactly what he'd inherited, a balance sheet bloated with toxic real estate and mortgage bets that could sink a fleet. He also knew he couldn't tackle it alone. So he set his sights on two men who'd been sidelined by the old regime, Mike Gelbin and Alex Kirk. Brilliant, sharp-eyed, risk-savvy, they had warned of this storm years earlier, only to be dismissed. Bart wanted them back. He needed them. Without them, he was steering blind. On June 17, 2008, three men met in a modest Upper West Side apartment. Bart, Mike, and Alex. No glass walls, no polished boardroom table. Just a kitchen light and the quiet resolve of veterans called back to a burning building. Their brief was stark. Carve down Lehman's monstrous real estate risk before the heat turned fatal. Even as plans took shape across a coffee ring table, a thought pressed at Bart's ribs. The fire might already be through the walls. Outside, mercy was in short supply. Mortgage values slid across continents. Buyers vanished like a tide pulled by some dark moon. Lemon's property book wasn't large. It was Leviathan. Trying to unload billions in projects felt like selling sandbags in a flood. Everyone you called already had a basement full of water. The dragon didn't just breathe fire. Its coils were tight around the firm's throat. Still, early in Bart's tenure, a thin current of hope returned. Bringing back Gelbin and Kirk wasn't a headline stunt. It was a credibility repair. Traders trusted their eyes. Investors remembered their warnings. For a moment, the deck stopped tilting. But confidence doesn't serve as coupons or placate lenders. The whole sprawled beneath everything. One word told the story: Sunko. A mirage in the desert turned sinkhole, swallowing billions. Tower projects found no buyers. Housing tracts browned in the sun. Mortgage positions that once looked like assets hardened into ankle weights. And the one currency Bart needed most times spent itself faster every day. Rumor thickened in Washington and on Wall Street. After Bear Stearns, who was next? Lemon's name traveled from trading desk to breakfast show, from dinner table to cab ride. Hedge funds circled. Creditors pulled the line tighter, asking for fresh collateral. It became a poker game with a marked deck, and somehow everyone else could see our cards. Inside, old habits dragged at every decision. Years of fool's reign had left grooves. Loyalty outranked competence. Silence beat candor. Bart cut a different figure, but cultures have long memories. Some seniors clung to the fairy tale that property would bounce, that markets couldn't stay this low. Gelbin and Kirk knew what denial costs. They pushed to slash exposures, raise capital, even consider partners who would take a pound of flesh. Every road out ran past a toll booth. Erin Collins stood in the crosswind. Once the star CFO, she now carried Sarbanes-Oxley signatures like a weight belt. The strain showed. Bart tried to keep her close. In the end, she left for the quiet of the Hamptons, trailed by whispered sympathy from some, suspicion from others. Summer settled over the city, but 745 7th felt like a fortress under siege. Each morning brought a new demand from a lender, a fresh short attack, a rumor of a lifeline that never formed. The numbers were brutal. The mood was worse. Struck turned to shuffle. Conversations frayed into mid-sentence silences. In the cafeteria, heads bent over phones. Voices came in halves. It didn't feel like an investment bank. It felt like a keep waiting for the final battering ram. Bart kept fighting. No euphemisms, no false dawns. But he could read the ledger. Too much weight chained to too many drowning assets. This wasn't a dragon to be tamed. At best, you bought minutes. At worst, you got ash. As August bled into September, the smoke thickened. The fight no longer felt like saving one firm. It felt like trying to stop a continent from sliding. Then the hurricane arrived. By early September, each morning was a battlefield brief. The shorts had our scent. We were patching a hull already opened by the iceberg. Collateral calls lit the fuse. On September 4th, G. Morgan asked for another $5 billion in cash. The first batch of collateral we posted had slumped in value. Trust went with it. We scraped together 3, and instead of relief, the street heard a siren. If we could only find part of it, what else was missing? Word leaked that we would pre-announce losses paired to hit with a forward plan, try to get in front of panic. Big banks warned it would do the opposite unless we raised capital first. A sale of Neuberger for $8 billion was floated. Knowledgeable voices pegged it closer to 3. The arithmetic didn't comfort anyone. On September 10th, 80 managing directors packed the 4th-floor auditorium. Tom Humphrey and Eric Felder laid out the lifeboat. Spinko a place to stash the bleeding real estate book. Dress the wound elsewhere. Keep the core afloat. The room held its breath. Then Mo Grime had let go anger, disbelief, the verdict many had kept behind their teeth. It wasn't rescue. It was a shell game in a burning suit. The shouting that followed sounded like a dam giving way. Potential saviors arrived, looked, and turned. Bank of America flirted, then chose Merrill with its army of brokers. Korean interest cooled without a nudge from government. Barclays circled but refused to swallow the real estate stone. Meanwhile, G. Morgan tightened again, credit halted, more collateral demanded. We raided accounts abroad, even emptied London desks. Every scramble bought a day and caused a layer of dignity. The floor pushed back. A wall of shame went up, leadership memos repurposed as punchlines. The old aura cracked, and what leaked out wasn't fear so much as fury. One last appeal. Mike Gelbin and others asked George Walker, cousin to the man then seated in the Oval Office, to call the White House directly. Make the case. Warn of the shock about to roll across oceans. He tried. The switchboard didn't pass him through. And with that, the last thread frayed. Sunday, September 14th. Cameras massed outside 745-7. Inside, boxes filled. Some cried. Some walked stiff-backed and dry-eyed. Jeremy Stafford told anyone who asked that he'd given his best. Standing across the street, it felt less like an ending than a procession, the long goodbye of an era. In the early hours of Monday, September 15th, the record set itself. Chapter 11. The largest bankruptcy in history. $660 billion in assets knotted against over $600 billion in debt. 158 years, closed by a stamp. Shock carried through the circuits. The Treasury Secretary stepped to the podium, voice even, message unmistakable. Lehman would not be saved. The market's reply was not philosophical. The Dow dropped 500 points. Confidence, already thin, tore. By morning, the second ring of collapse appeared. AIG opened down 60%, strangled by credit default promises tied to Lehman's fall. With no cash to meet them, the insurer reeled. Days after refusing a rescue for us, Washington leaned the other way. The Federal Reserve extended an $85 billion line, taking most of the company. One building burned, another was nationalized. From where we stood, the contrast stung. Barclays arrived for what it wanted. Prime brokerage, trading desks, the tower at 745 7th. $250 million for the businesses, $1.5 billion for the building. Overnight, the blue logo replaced our nameplate. 10,000 jobs found a raft. Many of us didn't. We walked out with our boxes and a handful of disbelief. The courtroom scene matched the chaos. A 15-page filing for a case that should have taken a binder to live. Under pressure, Judge James Peck approved the sale, later calling it the most harrowing moment of his career. The process bowed beneath the emergency. The human spillover was everywhere. Savings erased, options turned to dust. College plans postponed, houses listed, lives repacked. Even at the top, fire sales, helicopters, beachfronts, art. In Europe, the lights went out faster. Funds swept to New York in the final hours. Doors in London shut on empty drawers. Careers ended not with meetings, but with padlocks. Markets overseas fell in concert. Indexes that had swaggered months before lost a third, then half. The comforting myth of decoupling dissolved in real time. Wall Street's heart attack became a global cardiac event. Washington came back with TARP $700 billion, requested to pin the system together. A brief rally, then another plunge. By October, the Dow lived beneath 9,000 and the fear gauge set records. For people far from trading floors, the story clarified. This wasn't about banks anymore. It was jobs, homes, pensions, the fabric of the ordinary. Inside our circle, the grief was particular. We'd given years, some their whole adult lives. There were fists raised in defiance and quiet departures down crowded sidewalks. It felt like burying a city you built, brick by brick, with your own hands. One thought will not leave. It didn't have to finish like this. There were offers, imperfect but real. There were warnings, early and loud. There were calls that could have been answered. But the clock ran, and when it stopped, so did Lemon. What remained was a new world that didn't yet know its shape.